Okay, yes. Yeah, he was saying he didn't have experiments anyway.
Yeah.
That's what Leonard said in the lecture too. He was saying that he didn't have that perspective on experiments, and it's probably good they didn't, because the experiments are complicated. He said that that's why partially what he thought, or what the Greeks thought induction was just enumeration, because they didn't have that perspective on experiments yet.
I think Peacock was wrong on that point, though. I don't think they thought it was just enumeration.
Yeah.
I mean, they definitely knew it was more, but they didn't know how to do it better. I mean, enumeration was part of it, but they knew induction was relevant, and there's things to do, and it wasn't just enumeration, but they didn't have a better tool like the concept of experiment. Experiment is a giant step in induction that makes a huge difference. It doesn't even require, and coming up with that idea is a dramatic change in reasoning. Like, I mean, you don't even need complex technology to make tremendous steps right away. But the Greeks had pretty interesting technology. And you can imagine if they had experiments, like they could have gone industrial age within 100 years.
Yeah.
If they had experiments, but they didn't know how to experiment. So
when did we start them? When did the experimenting start?
1600s, 1700s.
Oh, okay.
Industrial Revolution, basically.
Right. Oh, okay. So the Industrial Revolution, the genesis of it is with experimentation.
Probably is like Francis Bacon, among some others. Like they came up with the method of experiment, like or Galileo possibly, but not even him. He was Platonic, but the real Plato was pretty, or Galileo was relatively Platonic and against Aristotle in a way, at some level. But that's a detailed point. The point is that experiment was key to great strides in science and induction even.
So is that what Feynman is talking about when he says natural philosophy? He's probably speaking about the beginning of experimentation in the 1600s.
Well, natural philosophy was often before experiments even, where we didn't really have science per se, but you study the natural world in a way that's in like the, say, 500 AD. If you studied animals, it would be, oh, that's natural philosophy, because it's just thinking about things. There was no reason to distinguish science per se from everything else, other than generally science with just a specific type of reasoning. It wasn't like, oh, there's biology, chemistry, blah, 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 because there is no reason. It was just philosophy, not more advanced than philosophy.
Oh, okay, I see.
More concrete than that. It's just too general for them to really see it any other way other than like a philosophical view.
I get it. And also natural is to make the distinction between supernatural, so theology and maybe ethics.
Yeah, or
that's probably
things that are just universals or just abstract. Like if you're thinking about like the rules of logic, that wouldn't really be natural philosophy.
Right.
That's still philosophy, obviously.
Right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, he did mention that he didn't see that he didn't agree with Plato that there was one final abstraction you would get to, but rather you could get to, in each specific field would have its ultimate abstraction. And then you could deduce from that, but you have to get there first. So you don't deduce that abstraction from the beginning. One of the specialized fields he said in the lecture was the kind of field that encompasses logic and these distinctions between form and matter that Aristotle made, and the universal and the particular.
Yeah, I think so.
And so, okay, but everything began with one field, and so there's a kind of flowering of that field, and then you get all these different branches. But then it seems like, from what I read in his notes, that there is such a great relationship between the fields that you can't really properly, that is to say, if you're not to just learn stuff and be good at deductive application, but you're able to think about the field properly, you need to study everything. And by that, I mean just fundamentals. So like you'd have the fundamentals of physics, of geology, of chemistry in order to actually, it doesn't mean you know the specialized details because it's not possible. As he said, like you can't be a universalist anymore because it's too much, but you'd have to know the fundamentals to get anywhere. Would you say that's right?
To get anywhere? I don't know about that.
To create, I guess, to really innovate or do something with that knowledge.
Well, I think you need a couple. I don't know about like needing to know most things even, but I think if you know a couple, you should be able to do fine or work things out fine. Like I'm not big on physics, like I like biology and zoology a lot. So I'd like prefer to study that if I had a choice. I don't really, chemistry sometimes is fine interesting, but physics not really. So I mean that's one thing I leave out. But other things I find fascinating and they help me reason from those. And when I do need to know physics, I have some ability to understand based on the other principles of reasoning and just work it all together. And it gradually builds together as a cohesive whole.
And then, but you find, yes, I agree. It can't be the case that you have to know most things, but it would be, there's probably like, don't you find that whenever you do end up in physics or needing to understand some concept in physics, it's usually going to be a fundamental concept rather than some.
Yeah, I think you're right, actually, about that. I mean, I often try to get a general idea of things because I find it most valuable. I know that makes me sort of a polymath in a way, but I think that is the best way to think about things, is to be multifaceted in your knowledge. I do think a basic book or thing on physics is very useful if that's the sort of reasoning you're into, which I think is pretty valuable generally. I think biology is quite useful as a field that helps you reason. And a basic idea on those goes a long way.
I'm not into any field in particular, but I just think that from what I've read and understood, it makes sense to study the earliest fields that are most developed and have the best methodology for thinking, and just focus on the fundamentals. So obviously you specialize if you're really fascinated by it, but there is value in focusing on the fundamentals of like physics and then biology and then chemistry. And then from there you can branch to whatever you want, because with grasping those fundamentals, I assume I'm just speculating based on my understanding. With grasping those fundamentals, you can make those crazy analogies that Feynman does, when he answers questions, his brain's loaded with all these examples.
Yeah, I think that's the right approach, the way you're describing it.
So if we were to rephrase what Peikoff said in the lecture, which is this, is too much known for anyone to be able to encompass it all today. And so to do original work in every field, every special field included, or maybe I typed this out wrong. But anyway, the point is there's too much known to be able to encompass everything like Aristotle did and do original work like he did in every specialized field. He said the Renaissance was the last period in which universal geniuses were possible. But if we were to, I think that makes sense. But if we were to look at that, do you think it's not valid then to say, okay, well, you're not going to innovate, you're not going to originate, but if you do want to be a genius and you want to be in a specific field, let's say, which is challenging enough, he even said that's like, be content just with that. But if you do want to be a genius, even in a specific field, then you are required to encompass everything, but not just the fundamentals in a sense. So not like not every single little thing that exists, but the fundamental fields. So that would be philosophy, physics, maybe biology, maybe chemistry. And then from there you specialize, but you wouldn't, be studying quantum mechanics, for example.
Yeah, I mean, Aristotle got there first, and you can get there too. It's just, and you can know at the same level as him and the same variety as him. It's just, you're not going to innovate that, obviously, as you said.
Yeah,
because he got there first. I think you put Aristotle into today, he would not necessarily seem any more smart than maybe somebody who knows just than Feynman. Like he would know that he knows a lot, but it's not like it was some capacity that was not possible. That's not possible anymore. I think to be a thinker like Aristotle, you need to be as well versed as he was in a variety of subjects.
Yeah.
The same sort of breadth.
Yeah.
And obviously, Aristotle didn't get to psychology much, so that's something like even he didn't have an expertise in everything.
Yeah.
But he covered a lot. And
Yeah,
I think any person should strive to know a lot about a lot.
I like that. I didn't know this, but I learned it from the lectures on Plato, that psychology means the study of the soul. That's its root.
Yeah, like a life force is more what they thought of it as.
Okay. What else did I want to ask you? Oh, they said, Feynman also said that, or at least he and the other people who wrote these lectures, they personally don't consider maths a science. I don't know what they consider maths, but I'll tell you their reasoning, which given their premises actually makes sense. To them, one of the essentials of science is empirical experiments. And because mathematics it's a deductive science and it doesn't involve empirical experiments, they don't consider it a science.
I agree personally, as far as just the word science.
Right. So in that case, you might even say science, not science, sorry, maths is a language.
Aristotle calls it a science, but he calls deductive things science. So he uses the word science in a different way. So Aristotle talking about science, he just means deduction. Usually, which would be science, or geometry, or reasoning from premises.
Right. Okay. Cool. Very cool. I'll get rid of this. Something, excuse me, I was thinking about is I don't know if this is a cultural, like historical cultural thing, or it's something else. So you may or may not have thoughts on this, but I have noticed that I read a book, Shantaram, which is based in India, and one of the main characters, who's a mob boss, and he's a very powerful and famous mob boss. He's into philosophy and poetry. And in ancient China, apparently, if you were like I don't know how true this is, but like the generals or the commanders would be able to recite poetry by heart, and that was like something to be proud of. And there's even I randomly found this on YouTube. There's like this scene where some guy's boasting that he's memorized 100 poems in front of this like group of royalty and soldiers, and they're all telling him, okay, well, show us. And then the whole scene is just him getting drunk and reciting 100 poems from memory. And similar in Musashi, which I've read, all these like warlords, they all like poetry. It's like a poetry and philosophy. So is there a link there? Is the link just cultural? Like, okay, that's just the times, in those times, and in the East, let's say in China and India, if you were anybody, then you had to learn poetry.
I think the Romans were the same way. As far as I understand.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I know like even Nero was like obviously known as a terrible Roman emperor, but all the Roman emperors like knew poetry or philosophical, but there are plenty of them that were evil too, despite knowing they're being into philosophy and poetry.
Yeah, same here.
I think
same in this example. I wrote this guy, Abdul Khan or whatever, was a mob boss, and he was also into philosophy and
I would think almost like that's like Nero or Caligula, those really bad Roman emperors.
So what is that then? Is it just, should I just say it's culture, like nothing, I can't get beneath that, or what?
Well, like what relation is that to their way of thinking?
Yeah, today, like you don't see Jeff Bezos reading some poetry before he goes into space, or Elon Musk before he sends a rocket, or the generals in an army saying a poem of how they're going to destroy their foes before they invade another country. Like that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew why, because I think that would be a great thing. I don't know why that's changed. I do imagine that sounds cool. If just Bezos did that, like, but he doesn't. So it's like, where is this person why did this die out? Why was
Yeah.
it seen as this great thing that you're intellectual, you're respectable, you're admirable? Even the lowest people enjoy this intellectual fighting, so to speak. I don't know why that died out or why that's less appealing than it used to be.
Yeah.
I bet Nietzsche wrote about that. That sounds like something Nietzsche would write about. Why the death of the intellectual or something, the death of the real philosopher, something like that. I bet he would write something about that.
Well, I'll read him once I start
Yeah.
getting some more traction with history and Aristotle. I
That's
wanted
a
to
neat
ask.
observation. I like that observation.
I wanted to ask you about a post I made here. Actually, this is typically my, or has in the past been my approach to things. When I learn something, I tend to, I would think I put it in productivity and writing. Yeah. I tend to, because if I learn a subject, I think this is a perfect example. I try to like brute force the learning process. So this is the essay Virtue of Selfishness. And I went through the whole essay and I try to categorize everything like this.
Yeah.
And actually it's good as a reference, but it didn't help me at all. And so I typically repeat this pattern of I want to learn something. And so I kind of brute force my way through it, including very comprehensive notes. But it's clearly not effective. And I know this now, but that's what I have done. And I guess my thinking was, like going forward, it seems like I should be trying to do this, which is not aiming for big essays, because I spend so long and I don't get anywhere, but little short summarized paragraphs of things. So like, let's say for each lecture on history of philosophy, I might do a little short summary paragraph. Starting there seems to be a good alternative. What are any additional ideas or thoughts?
Well, I think you're right that brute force method, I think is good for note taking. It's a good reference, but it's not necessarily good for learning.
Yeah.
As learning, I think you're right that a short thing is better. Sort of like what I was doing with my Aristotle reading. Like of each chapter, I do almost each chapter. If something was interesting, I write a paragraph, maybe 2 sentences.
Right.
If it actually stood out. And maybe I write more if it's confusing to me.
Right.
Or if it was really interesting. I just write more just to clarify it to myself. I don't worry about if I don't always get it, if I don't get it sometimes. I just leave it. It's like I say, I'm confused. I don't get it. I'll move on. I note that even. And another way to go about doing that is after you listen to something, write down one question you would ask based on what you just learned or what you just have fresh in your memory. What would you ask? And I think Feynman does that, or said that he would often ask a question to himself about after learning something, not just repeating what you've learned, but saying, what would you ask? What new thing would you ask now?
Right. I know that Feynman would often ask lots of quotes here, dumb questions, meaning he'd constantly try to relate what he was hearing or learning about what the model, the theory, the equation to actual physical reality. So he did that too, which is, I guess, the equivalent of concretization, right?
I think so. I mean, there's a lot of methods of studying that might be worth investigating that would be very useful. I think there's a channel I know of on YouTube that was pretty good. I'll show you.
Yeah, please.
It's nothing too complicated.
Yeah,
but enough that it'll be more productive when reading. But for example, my method is usually what I've been doing in those Aristotle pages. So if you want to look at what I do, your mileage may vary, but my method is what, and you see it there. So you can use that as an example if you want.
Okay. Yeah, I might do that. We can divvy up, like, for example, maybe some weeks we might even do only two in person or 3 in person, and then the rest would be, like little summarized paragraphs and then feedback and discussion after, or something like that, right? We can try alternate the format.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to? Are you happy to go over? I watched the video you sent me and I took some notes. I was trying to.
I've watched it like twice.
Okay, perfect.
I've watched it twice at least because I really like that talk. Like, because it's not even about physics, and he was still very insightful and still true, and that was 30 years ago, or 40 almost.
Right.
And it's still just as valid.
Yeah, I really like him. I think I'll tell you what notes I made and what I thought, and then you can tell me, you can criticize, fill in any gaps you think I may have missed. But I was trying to just make observation of what he was doing when he was answering questions. So I noticed he always began by clarifying what the person meant, and usually even specifying the definition for them in multiple ways. So he wouldn't just outright say, here is the definition. Like, someone asked a question, he's like, well, what do you mean by more than, or what do you mean by intelligent? He wouldn't just go from that to say, okay, well, intelligence means this. He'd actually answer the question from multiple angles, which capture different aspects of intelligence. So kind of answers a lot rather than one thing. That's one thing I picked up on. And that even included, on the first question of, are machines more intelligent? It even included what the person means by more. What is this standard? Because he did say that a lot of people just they assume that for a machine to be superior than a human, meaning more intelligent than a human, that he has to be superior in every single aspect. So he has to beat a chess master and beat a master painter and scratch his head also to take out the lice. And he just clarified that. So I think he's very, very precise in his terms, and he's conscious of what, on average, a person thinks certain terms mean, or what they can conceptualize as those terms, what they conceptualize those terms as, and then he answers from those multiple perspectives. There's that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll stop there, but I've got more to say. So
yeah, that is very much like Aristotle. Like, that's always where it begins, or one of the beginning places, depending on the subject. Sometimes they'll mention what other people have said, maybe, or definition, but not always. But there's always distinctions among different words to clarify what people mean. What exactly do they mean by more, for example, there? Right. It's not just being pedantic, but really these things are ambiguous, and you can analyze them in an interesting way. Like, you could make those distinctions and parse things apart to really see, what are we talking about? Are there relevant observations? What observations do we need to take into account? What definitions do people like to use? Do we even know a definition yet? You might define something now, but be prepared to redefine it later. I mean, that sort of thing. But always begin by clarifying, what are we talking about? What's the definition? What are our terms? And that's, I think, very valuable in this method, or what Feynman's doing.
He's very streamlined about it, though, because he doesn't come at it from, okay, give me a definition, or here is the genus differentia. He goes into concrete examples which capture those different definitions. So, he talks about, does being superior mean identifying the wiggle of Joan or scratching lice from your head, which was, I think, from a separate question. But
yes,
he gives it that way rather than, okay, give me a definition in abstract terms.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think implicitly it does. And I don't think you can always need to do it explicitly, as much as he's involved with he is doing genus differentia, but he's not explicit about it. You might not realize it, but he's definitely doing that. He's like distinguishing what is intelligence, or what is a machine, broadly speaking. He does classify things. So if you parse it out, you'll probably see that he's done that.
Yep.
I think. Yeah.
There's a latter part in this question that I really liked, where he speaks about the form depends on the function given the constraints of the material that you have. That's my formulation of it, because he didn't put it in abstract terms like that.
Yeah.
But he gave the analogy of a cheetah. I don't know, is that how you say it in America? Cheetah.
No.
Cheetah. Oh, okay.
Cheetah. Just cheetah. He just says it weird. Cheetah. I don't, it's hilarious.
Maybe he says it for fun. Who knows?
Probably. Knowing him.
He gives the analogy of the cheetah, and he says that, you know, if you don't have the material, like we don't have the organic materials to make a cheetah. So if you're going to make something that can move as quickly as a cheetah out of non-organic mechanical components, why would you try and emulate it exactly? Like, you should be approximating the function given the constraints of the material that you have. So for example, that's wheels or airplane or air, or, you know, jet, or what's it called? Wheel or engines. Airplanes fly, but not like a bird. They don't flap. In this sense, intelligence won't be the same. So he was trying to make this distinction between the process and the end product. I didn't quite know what he was doing there, but I liked it.
Yeah, I think he's trying to distinguish that. I mean, if you want to do it like a cheetah exactly, you would do it exactly like the cheetah.
Yeah.
But you're not really trying to do that.
Yeah.
Why do you want to do it perfectly exact? You want to do it different.
Yeah.
The very act of making the machine anyway will make it different. It doesn't mean it can't accomplish the same thing, but it can't do it in the same way, obviously.
Right.
It's made of different things. So as they get there differently, like a bird and a seal could get to an island the same way, but one flies, one swims. They're obviously doing it different. They solve the same problem. They just are different creatures. So by nature, though, they have different constraints and they get there differently. Despite their similarities, they both have perception. Obviously, that's something they have in common. So that's what you might say they're doing the same, but it's not identical, obviously. They have different capacities.
Sort of off topic, but do you know if Aristotle's four causes, did he intend for them to encompass everything? So they're metaphysical causes, they encompass every single thing that happens, every change?
No.
Or just, oh, okay.
I mean, just like, at least some of them. I mean, not all causes have final cause. I mean, not all things are explained by a final cause, not all things.
Right.
Well, some things happen incidentally, and those don't have a final cause, for example.
Right. And does he discuss that?
Well, I'm thinking, yes, he discusses the distinction. But I didn't read the book yet where he gets in depth to the causes.
Right. Okay.
That's the next book I read, I think. When I get to physics, I'll read about that.
Okay. So in the second question, someone asks about, can computers discover new relationships by themselves? And he does the exact same thing. You know, he even goes, depends what you mean by themselves, or something like that. Yeah, and then he goes into what are we comparing? You know, what aspects of the two different things? Are we looking at the result or the process? He talked about the machine learning algorithm that develops like battleship strategies.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, does it matter? And then I don't quite remember, but this is when he started going on about like, you know, he was like half jokingly complaining that humans are like, does the computer know what it's doing? And he's like, well, you know, if the computer accomplishes a calculation, it's like asking can it scratch the lice out of its head while it's doing the calculations? So yes, I think that's the same thing of just trying to differentiate between, you can accomplish the same end goal, but the process is different.
Yeah, that
That's
point
my
was a
take
bit
on
odd
things.
to me, but that point was a bit odd. I wasn't sure what he meant. I just found it more funny than insightful for that line, but I do think, yeah,
Yeah,
he was
cool.
making valuable distinctions about the way people think.
I read this. I think so. One thing is you said preferably you would also better distinguish between grounding knowledge on the one hand and extracting value on the other. That's actually my mistake, because I would say that grounding knowledge is a species of extracting value. So I've said and to make knowledge, but I should say to extract maximum value by making knowledge better grounded.
That would be fine. That would
Yeah.
be a good fix.
And then you said, as a secondary point, it's not that the artist provides you with guidance or that they have a particular insight into abstraction. Rather, the resulting piece of art and its elements provides concretes that are necessarily connected with some abstraction, or more like you're saying you guide yourself to extract the abstraction from the work. I agree, but my question then is, isn't it still a sort of guidance, because they're focusing on some particular aspect that's interesting or obvious or something you wouldn't have thought about? But I don't want to be too abstract here, so maybe I'll just go straight to the question. But isn't this basically then the same thing as looking at a concrete out in the world? Like, the resulting piece of art and its elements provide concretes that are necessarily connected with some abstraction, but so is every concrete in the world.
Trying to think of a phrase that. Well, I'm saying that the artist has an abstraction in mind specifically, and they made it concrete. I mean, you could have every abstraction as a corresponding concrete, but doesn't mean every concrete that exists has an abstraction connected with it, including things that you don't know about yet. That's kind of what I mean. Or you might not have abstracted, make an abstraction about something that is real in reality, or say a historical event you didn't know about.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I'm trying to distinguish from.
So
I'm just trying to say that, yes, the abstraction is connected with the concrete, and it necessarily is valid, or it isn't necessarily connected with. The two are connected just because the artist did it. And obviously abstractions can be disconnected from concretes, but at least as far as artwork is concerned, the abstraction is connected to this at least invented concrete, like a sculpture or whatever, or this character. It's an imagined character, but in that sense, it's still concrete because it's still a real person, or not a real person, but a created person. And so the abstraction is connected to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then, so when you're saying it's not that the artist provides you with guidance and that they have particular insight into abstraction, would you say that's the case explicitly, but not implicitly? Because why then, if it were true that there was no added value from any sort of guidance or insight, then you wouldn't need art. I would just look out into the world and go, oh, let me do my value extraction on my daily life. And so
you can, that makes sense. So I would point out just that the artist is not necessarily intending to guide you, but you can find guidance in what they leave behind.
And so what's the cause of that when they don't intend it? Why is their guidance implicit guidance when it's not intended in art specifically?
Well, because art is usually done for its own sake, not for a particular viewer, or at least I think it ought not to, if it's the ideal kind of art. Art is generally done for its own reasons, not for any didactic end. I mean, it could be done that way, but not necessarily. They might want to guide you to it, but it might just be incidental.
I meant, why is there even implicit guidance in art? Let's say the person didn't explicitly guide you, but then why the value of the art is, if it's not explicitly guided, the guidance is implicit, where does the value of it derive from? Is it just the fact that certain important principles and abstractions that don't happen often in day-to-day life are always present in art? Or what's the cause then of the guidance it provides that's not explicit?
Just that there's an abstraction made concrete, and you might then, as we've talked about, like the cognitive value of art, that by at least concretizing that abstraction, well, I could look for this in real life. I could think of real life examples to compare it to. I can think about what its creative thoughts inspires in me. What else does it make? How does it help me think better? Does it help me make distinctions better, or find these concretes in real life to validate their truth, or to make it correspond to something in real life? The same way you might read like The Fountain and see inspiration from Rourke. It's not necessarily because Rand wanted you to find that guidance, but you can find the guidance because she's made concrete an abstract ideal. You see, oh, I see Rourke. Who else is like that in real life? Is there anyone like that in real life? But at least since it's concrete, you have a way to think about it that's clearer than just an abstract set of words, like telling you what the ideal is in abstract terms, like someone who lives out the nature of the good. Like, that's abstract, it's detached. It's hard to understand, as well as, oh, here's a person. This is what I mean by a good, virtuous person. And then from there, you can say, oh, is that real? Who is like that? What is like that? Is this really something that can happen naturally?
So is the power then, is the source of the power from the selectivity? Meaning, because everything you said I could apply to daily life as well. Like I could look for abstractions in people, in concretes. And so is the source of this implicit guidance and the power of the fiction that a whole life is condensed into, like certain things that we have down pat as far as abstractions go, like cooking food, omitted. Is that what the power is?
I would
where
say
the power's
so.
derived from? Yeah. Okay.
The power is the selectivity of what they've selected. They've selected things that now all you're doing is focusing on these things they selected, which you might not have done on your own. You might not have known to select these aspects of reality. So in that way, you find guidance in a way of selecting things that you have not seen before, or a way that helps you think better.
Okay, I get it.
Incidentally.
All right, I see now. Yeah, so the guy, I mean, unless you're reading Aesop's Fable, the guidance is implicit. The guidance is in the fact that the artist is selectively picking out different aspects of reality that you may not have observed as a unity. Maybe that's too abstract, but like, there's certain character types. Let's say there's Rourke, who's very independent and he thinks for himself and he validates what he learns for himself, and he doesn't just fall into what others are thinking, and so on and so on. And so in seeing you, for whatever reason in your development as a person to a certain point, you may not have been on the lookout for that, but now an artist has observed that and given that expression in Rourke. And so then when you go out into the world after that, it was all there before, you then almost leaning on a perspective and looking for that now too. That's what's going on, right?
Yeah, the artist has selected something, and now you can see if that selection does correspond to something real. You can be on the lookout for that distinction the artist has noticed.
Right.
Which was the artist was not trying to do that necessarily.
Yeah.
Sometimes they might, but not necessarily. And it's just incidental that that wasn't their objective, but it is a value of art that's what makes art valuable to more than just the artist. Otherwise, just the artist would do it and nobody would care. But you're right that that's what gives it art power for thinking.
So if Aristotle wrote an equivalent of Atlas Shrugged or Homer's Epic, you would have, in addition to his theory, you would then have that perspective on all kinds of random things in his day-to-day life. Is that?
Well, day to day, I mean, what do you mean exactly?
What do you think then? If I had to ask you, okay, let's say Aristotle did write an epic and it was a fiction or a long poem, what would be the added perspective? Like, what would be added in the perspective that you'd get
Compared to
just reading, what? Let's say, all his treatises?
Well, it would bring, I think, a wider vision of things and bring to terms, make those abstractions more real, more accessible, more impactful. I think more of a impact on your way of life more than your, like, how does it impact the way you think in a practical sense, the way you think about your life. I think it would have a great impact on. And I think it just abstracts away the particulars that you don't really care about. It is, right. I think it's more of the emotional fuel though.
Yes, values. I was just thinking.
Really just values, I think, is where it comes down to. Like, could you learn the same things? Could you learn everything there is to know about physics without reading any art? Sure. But your life would be probably empty and you'd be lacking in other intellectual ways that you've made life harder than it needs to be. You made learning harder than it needs to be. That's how I would put it.
Right. Law of cause and effect. Every action has a cause, and the same cause leads to the same effect, assuming it's the same entity of the same nature and under the same circumstances. How does that apply to man?
What do you mean? I mean,
because a man under the same circumstances will not act the same way. So then how would I tailor that to, would I just say, well, would the answer to that be, you need to think on a higher resolution and say the nature of man is to make a choice. So under the same entity, man, under the same set of circumstances, will make a choice. And that's all we can say. That's in his nature.
I'm still working on ways to answer this sort of question in ways that are clear to others. Like, it's abstract to me and I don't know yet how to make it quite clear. But I do think if you're in the same circumstances, the exact same, and I mean no change to the circumstance, I do think you would take the exact same action.
Oh, right. Okay.
But
because, like you're saying, if we were to go rewind a year and look at you at hour 3 of Wednesday morning, then in that context, you'd still make the same choice. But
yeah, that's what I mean.
Right. Oh, I can't get more difference. Clear. I get it. No, I get it.
It's hard for me, but that's the gist of it.
I get it. Answer. You're basically saying, however you look at it with a person, it's very hard to get the exact same circumstances because the time will be different, right? You can't have the same time, and you can't have the same weather, and you can't. There's a lot of okay.
I know people have disagreed with me, but
a
lot of people disagree with me, but that's my answer to that.
All right. Cool.
But yeah, that's just my